I love that song. Pat James and the Whole Truth. That is Hey Now. You can find Pat's music on Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, or wherever you get songs that you like. Pat is great, and I really appreciate him letting me use that song for this podcast. Welcome to it, friends. No episode yesterday. Today is Thursday, the 9th of July. Yesterday I was off because I was celebrating my birthday, and I just took the day off. I went out and played golf with my dad. It was awesome. I had a great afternoon. And you know, it's funny because I had to hold myself back. I almost put out an episode yesterday about something that I was flaming hot about, and I've decided I'm going to wait and I'm going to do it in this episode. By the way, I am going to talk about that in just a sec, but I also want to let you know, coming up, you're going to hear from our defense minister, you're going to hear from the prime minister, and you may even hear from President Trump in this episode. I'm going to try and get you caught up on what happened over the last 48 hours, in particular, though, when it comes to NATO. Big G7 summit was happening, and we got to talk about that. We got to talk about NATO. We got to talk about the G7. We got to talk about a whole bunch of different things because some weird stuff was said by our leaders. Before I get to that, though, I got to talk about this. As you've likely heard by now, the folks over at Rogers have acquired the outstanding shares that they didn't already own in MLSE. That means that Rogers now owns the Blue Jays, the Maple Leafs, the Raptors, the Argos, and the list goes on. They also have Rogers Center, Scotiabank Arena, and more. They've made themselves a massive sports business. But they're also a broadcaster, among other things. And they have been in the radio market for a very, very long time. Well, the day after they announced they're spending almost $4 billion to buy up the rest of MLSE, they announced they're shutting down 6 local radio stations and firing the staff. And I don't mean just regular run-of-the-mill radio stations. I mean news stations. There's already very limited ways that Canadians can get news. We've seen the demise of the newspaper. There aren't a whole lot of those floating around these days. That was the way that people used to get informed. That and television news. Well, trust in television news is also way, way down. Radio was still very relevant. You know, Rogers is going to say things like the audience was declining, ad revenue was declining, we had to shut it down. Well, I have no doubt that money may be an issue for Rogers because they just spent a ton of it in sports. But to do it, they're now gutting part of their broadcast industry. And I've got a real problem with that. The way it works, just so you know, is if you want to start up a radio station, you put an application in to the CRTC, the Canadian Radio Telecommunications Commission. You put in your application, they'll ask, does anybody else want this license? And they'll figure out who is best in that area to operate a radio station. And back in the day, we had lots and lots and lots of different radio owners. Independent broadcasters. Due to a regulatory change that allowed the big guys to come in and buy up a whole bunch of independent stations, we've seen a consolidation in the industry. In the same way that television news is dominated by 3, maybe 4 big players, and that's it. Same thing with radio, and it's a lot of the same television companies that are operating these radio stations. And at one point, it made a lot of sense for them. You know, buy these ads on television, and we can give you these radio ads for a real good deal as well, and you've got a full marketing solution. Well, as we know, people are consuming media differently. And maybe you assume, maybe you even heard, that radio audiences are declining. People don't listen to the radio anymore. I have that conversation with people all the time. Just so you know, all of the research is completely contrary to that. People are using radio. They don't listen as much as they once did, but make no mistake, radio is still very relevant, and a large portion of the population consumes it daily. Certainly weekly, and definitely monthly. People are still using radio. But listening patterns have changed a little bit. And part of the problem right now is radio isn't as good as it once was. So many incredible talent that made radio what you wanted to listen to have lost their jobs. Ad revenue is down, partly because the audience is down, but also partly because of the economy we find ourselves in. There's also a lot more competition from the digital giants. And the digital giants, if you've ever bought advertising on Instagram or Facebook or X or whatever, you know that it's actually fairly convenient to do. You can book your ad and set your budget and spend as much as you want to spend. Radio doesn't exactly work like that, but radio still reaches more people in a lot of cases. So anyway, listen, I don't want to go too far off on a tangent here. I want to stay focused on Rogers and what they've done. Rogers is letting a lot more radio people go, and people that were very, very good at either talk radio or sports radio or delivering the news. News in communities who count on getting their local news from radio. Rogers is just going to shut those radio stations down. They're not even trying to sell them. They're just going to shut them down, turn off the transmitter, save themselves a massive hydro bill every month, and save themselves the annoyance of paying those pesky radio personalities. We'll just pay them the severance and get rid of them. That's what they're doing. They're shutting down another source of news at a time when Canadians are craving news but questioning the credibility of the very few options that we have out there. That's part of the reason that podcasts are doing so well. Rogers is just going to shut them down. You know, at one point, Rogers was making a hell of a lot of money in radio. A ton of money. They still could. But the product has been kind of watered down. Radio isn't as local as it once was because in a time of consolidation, a lot of people got fired and a lot of programming comes out of either Toronto or Vancouver. And that's part of what they were doing with these news stations that got shut down. A lot of the programming wasn't happening locally, but it was generic enough that you could hear it in Winnipeg or in Calgary or in Halifax or what have you, and it still seemed like you were listening to something local. They were not paying the full complement of staff that they once did, where you had to staff a radio station in a standalone way with a ton of people. There was people all over the country doing different things for these different radio stations. Rogers, I'm led to believe, was also tapping into the federal wage subsidy for a lot of these news staff. But Rogers said, screw it. We don't want to do it anymore. And they're going to just hand in the license and turn off the transmitter. You know, given that Rogers once made a lot of money on these radio stations, given that there is a need for news in this country and more editorial voices, I don't understand why the CRTC is going to allow this. The CRTC should get Rogers on the phone and tell them, no, you're going to continue operations as you were until you can find someone or we can find someone who wants to take over that license. You don't get to just walk away when the market starts to look a little bleak. It doesn't work like that. And by the way, Rogers isn't the only station to do it. Many broadcasters have turned off radio stations, and I don't think that should be allowed. At one point, we spent a lot of money on public hearings and CRTC time and staff trying to determine if that license was viable and who should operate that radio property. Well, Rogers had a lot of prime radio real estate in, say, for example, the Kitchener-Waterloo area, 570 News. They were doing quite well with it. It was a well-respected voice in the community. Did Rogers even try to get the audience up and improve their business situation, or do they just not really care about radio? Kind of seems like television and sports are their priority. Is radio just dispensable to them? Because you know what? There are other broadcasters out there, independent broadcasters, who do care and know how to put out a good product and could be providing a service for the community. But no, Rogers had the license, they made a ton of money, and then when the market started to look bad or they had other interests and priorities as a company, they didn't even try and sell and do a service to broadcast and to local communities. They're just shutting it off. That shouldn't be allowed. They should be ordered to continue operations, and if they don't want to continue operations, then they should lose their licenses at the very profitable FM stations that they own. You can't just walk away. We get emergency alerts through the broadcast system. This is an important thing. You can't just turn it off. There's a lot of people, seniors and older adults in particular, who count on radio. It's just my opinion. I just don't think Rogers should be allowed to get away with this. I don't think it's right. I think Rogers should be held accountable for this. All right, friends, like I said, I was going to cover the NATO summit. Let's do that. Prime Minister Carney yesterday speaking at the end.
Secretary General, for organizing this meeting. It takes place at a context where the threats that we face are changing rapidly, both in terms of the nature of warfare, hybrid warfare, hypersonic missiles, autonomous warfare, and also the direct threats that we face in terms of hybrid warfare. Russia is a direct adversary. Burdens are shifting. Burdens are shifting away from the United States towards Canada, towards Europe. You see I'll speak for Canada, a big increase in our defense spending. It was only before I became Prime Minister 18 months ago, we were spending 1.5% of GDP on defense. It's now going to be 4% in the next 2 years.
Okay, first off, he is absolutely right. We did underspend. Everyone understands that, and everyone should understand why the Americans are upset. We were only spending 1.5%, well below what our counterparts were spending. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, what threat is he talking about? You know, I think I'm fairly up on these things. Does the Canadian government have some intelligence that says the Russians or the Chinese or the Iranians or somebody are going to attack us? He's talking like there's some clear and present danger here, and every single time he gets in front of a microphone, he pulls out that fear card. In a more dangerous and divided world, we need to talk about the threats to Canada. What threat? Who's the threat, and what is it? Should Canadians be concerned? You know, if you're going to throw that out there, the hyperbole, if you're going to talk nonstop about how we have to prepare ourselves for a threat, then tell us what the threat is. I think that's the fair thing to do for Canadians, because right now, I don't get it. You know, the Prime Minister can say till he's blue in the face, we need submarines right now. For what? What's the underwater threat? Is Russia coming to take the Arctic? Is China coming to take the Arctic? Are they or aren't they? Say it. Tell people what the concern is. It's the fair thing to do.
That gives an order of magnitude. We just completed our largest defense procurement with submarines, announced it 2 days ago. So the burdens are shifting, capacities are building. Capacities are building, and one thing I'd emphasize, and then I'll take one or two questions, is that those capacities are building on a regional basis. So if you're Canada, focus obviously on North American security and the crescent that runs through the Arctic down into the Baltics, and we will be announcing today the extension of our Operation Reassurance in Latvia. That's the type of approach of a modern NATO. That's the approach that meets the new threats that we face.
Despite your best efforts, despite your interesting relationship with the US President, can we say that? He doesn't want to be here. He said as much. He said he would only be here on the basis of that. He wanted to be here with Mr. Erdogan as well. Do you think actually the US is pulling out of NATO or wants to pull out of NATO quicker than we can fill in the gaps?
The first thing, I spoke at length with President Trump on Sunday prior to coming here. The president wants to see that shift in burden. I would remind that President Obama wanted to see that shift in burden, and it's appropriate that there is that shift. It's happening. That momentum is picking up, and it will proceed. And the president's here. He's in a good mood, and we're looking forward to discussing it. I'll take one last question then.
Before we get to that last question, hey, you know what? Credit to Mark Carney. Because that's not something the mainstream media is going to point out and make very obvious to everyone. But yes, the same concerns that President Trump raised that started a lot of this mess were also ongoing concerns of President Obama. He didn't like that Canada was underspending either. This has been an issue for a long, long time. Now, again, the Prime Minister talking about the need to step up and start shouldering the load. I think he's right. If it's a partnership, we've got to be partners. And the U.S. doesn't want to do it all alone anymore and put all the expense on their people. I think that's a perfectly reasonable position. It's also an opportunity for Canada. Now, again, I don't understand what the threat is, but if we're going to go all in on building and buying and things like that, that's great for our armed forces, and we could create a nice little industry around that here in Canada. They say the future is in unmanned vehicles like drones and whatever drones are that drive, like Teslas that are full of missiles and stuff. Hey, we could be doing that here. We've got some of the best and brightest in the world. Maybe this is an opportunity.
US attack on Iran, and why don't you fear that this will overshadow this summit?
Well, the first is I would observe that, in effect, a period of extreme de-escalation, shall I put it, had been put in place for the funeral. Iran had been acting irresponsibly, attacking Saudi and Qatari targets particularly. There has been a response as appropriate. We look to de-escalation of the hostilities, but it underscores the scale of the threats and the enduring threats the alliance faces. So thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Okay, that was Mark Carney. I don't know if he actually meant to say that, but pointing out that as an alliance, Iran is a threat to us. He was answering a question about the fact that the U.S. said the ceasefire with Iran is over. Iran broke it, and the Americans say now they're going to go in and finish it militarily. The Prime Minister did not seem in any way upset about that. Hey, I'm happy to hear that. Again, if it's a partnership, we're partners. The U.S. sees a threat here. Mark Carney has acknowledged that is a real threat to all of us, and he doesn't seem to have a problem doing what the U.S. is doing over there. Just so everyone's clear, because I know that this is going to be a contentious point when gas prices start to rise again. The Prime Minister is on side with this. I want to get to a couple of other clips from various things that happened at that NATO summit. And by the way, before, just a little thing. If anybody at NATO is listening, and I have my doubts that there are, but if there is, could you please put a microphone on the reporter? People want to hear the question along with the answer. Put a mic in front of the reporters. Holy cow. This should not be hard to figure out. Our defense minister here in Canada is David McGuinty. This is about 1 minute and 10 seconds long. This is him explaining the threats that we face.
I think the Canadian people realize that there's been a lot of change. I think they realize that our geography no longer protects us as a matter of course. I think they saw through this recent war in Iran, that Iran, for example, deployed a missile which traveled over 5,000 kilometers, having announced to the world for 2.5 decades that they had no such capacity, that they only had a missile that could travel 2,000, maybe 2,500 kilometers. The Canadian people know that the threat landscape has changed. The Canadian people understand that there are foreign interference activities going on. They understand that we need to make these investments.
Do they understand where the money is going to come from? Do you yourselves understand?
Yes, we do. We're growing our economy. We're making major investments in the defense sector to generate more wealth, create more jobs, and provide the resources we need to accomplish this goal. And we're well on our way. I mean, we have done things in the last 12 months which I think the Canadian people are very supportive of. I think they saw the announcement yesterday for the submarine choice, and I think they said that's a very positive thing for Canada's security and sovereignty.
Interesting. I mean, that's his perspective on it, and I suppose he would say that as the defense minister, but he said Canadians understand the threat. I don't understand the threat. He seemed to imply Iran is the threat, and the Canadian government, until now, hasn't really said much about Iran, acknowledging that there's a threat, and that was for political reasons. He didn't say China. He didn't say Russia. Let's be honest, Iran's not coming to invade our Arctic. They have no interest in the Canadian Arctic in Iran. So what is the threat? What is the need to spend all this money for? You know, if we are going to be procuring anyway, maybe we should customize that procurement based on the threat that we face. You know, if the Arctic is at threat and we have to defend it, maybe we should be focusing on things that are meant to function in cold weather or cold water. You know, I don't think we've learned anything after hearing from the defense minister there. He also said that the reason we can afford to do this is because the economy is growing. It's not growing. We're in a recession. So that's very, very misleading of him to say that. And by the way, just because the economy grows doesn't mean that every penny that comes in goes to defense. It has to go to a lot of different things that have been neglected for a while, not the least of which is healthcare and things like that. But I'm going to move on from the defense minister. Now let's go to the Secretary General of NATO. This is Mark Rutte taking a question at the end of the summit.
Rasmus Reineborg from the Danish news agency.
Yes, hi.
Danish news agency Ritzau. Mark, you sit next to Donald Trump in moments where he talks about conquering Greenland, talks about lashing out at allies like Spain, starting trade wars, things that it doesn't seem like the old Mark Rutte would approve of. Does this have any effect on your self-respect when you sit next to him like that and say nothing?
You know, what I always do is...
First off, wow, that's a gutsy question. Okay, but you know what? It's fair. It's very fair. Being the Secretary General of NATO was basically just collecting up the notes from the other leaders and parroting their talking points until very recently. Mark here has stepped up and been very vocal, trying to direct the rest of NATO to follow the U.S. lead, trying to encourage them to follow the U.S.'s demand that they increase their spending to what they committed that spending to be at. The question was, How do you have any self-respect when you sit beside Donald Trump and Donald Trump is talking about annexing Greenland? I'm very curious to hear this answer.
Is acknowledge when praise is due, and I think we should praise Donald Trump for the fact that NATO is so much stronger. Of course, it has to do with the Russian threat, it has to do with the war in Ukraine, but it very much also has to do with President Trump delivering now what since Eisenhower the United States tried to achieve, equalizing spending between the US and Europe. And it makes Europe stronger. It makes Europe more relevant for the United States as a partner. So that is the transformative character of this summit, of what happened in The Hague, the implementation since The Hague, this summit as a point in time where we take stock, and I think that is extremely important. And when it comes to Greenland, I already explained. We had a meeting in Davos. And I said, I agree with you when it comes to Russia, when it comes to China, gaining access to the High North. But let's do this together. We have NATO for this. Let's work together on this. This is exactly what we are doing.
Actually, you know what? I think that's a perfectly appropriate answer. And you know what? He kind of doubled down, too. I think what he's suggesting here is that Europe does need to become more relevant to the Americans. Absolutely. They will do that when they carry their own share of the load when it comes to spending on defense. But once that happens, I think Secretary Rutte is probably correct. You don't have to just hand the keys to Greenland over to the Americans. NATO can defend it. But the president doesn't have a whole lot of faith in NATO right now. I think he's being a very good statesman at the moment. He's trying to juggle a whole ton of different countries and personalities here, and he's trying to make it work. Full credit to him. I don't see it as ass-kissing. I think he just understands how the president works and what makes him tick. And I think he's trying to make the European leaders get on board with that. I'm going to go now to the Prime Minister, and I will get to some President Trump coming up. This is a separate media availability that Mark Carney did over in Turkey.
And I just said something to the effect, just as I was walking in. Big picture, the threats are changing rapidly. The threats that face Canada, the threats that face the alliance, evolution of the technical threats, if I can put it that way, from hypersonic missiles to autonomous warfare, hybrid warfare, the adversaries, Russia as a direct adversary. So that evolution is there.
Hold on. Let me ask this again, and you should be asking this as well. Is there a threat to the homeland here in Canada? Is there a threat? What is he talking about? Because right now, there's nothing to indicate that we're at threat of the the Russians or anyone else invading us. There's no indication that that's going to happen. Would the Iranians launch a hypersonic missile at Canada? Well, we do know that they had missiles that we didn't know they had. Ones that could reach far into Europe. But they can't reach North America. Not at the moment. What is the threat that he is talking about here? I'm all on board with increasing our defense spending. I think that this is something that we should have been doing a long time ago, and if we had, it wouldn't hurt so much getting ready to do it now, because it's going to cost a hell of a lot of money. But what is the threat? If you want to get people inspired about getting behind this, you got to tell us, what are you talking about? Let's go to some of the Q&A. In fact, we are in the Q&A. That was Mark Carney explaining something in English that he had answered in French.
The Secretary General said coming into this meeting that he would like to see from alliance members a clear and credible plan towards 5%. So did we present a comprehensive plan to NATO? At the same time, the C.D. Howe Institute has also said that Canada needs to be fiscally transparent about how it's spending defense dollars. And so publicly, can you say what our plan is for 5%?
Well, the first thing is, and this is what the public needs to know, is that the commitment at NATO is 5% 2035, so it's 9 years from now. First point. Second point, in a world where threats are evolving rapidly and burdens are shifting, what is also was agreed at the Hague Summit is that those objectives, those percentages, will be reviewed in 2030. Okay, so those two things are part of the overall environment. That's sensible, and Canadians expect us to be sensible. We have a need to increase our defense spending, increase our resilience spending to protect Canadians first and foremost and to support our allies. And we have some catch-up to do, without question. I came into government, we were spending 1.4% of GDP on defense, direct defense expenditure. We got that to 2% in the first time since the fall of the Berlin Wall. That's going to scale up to 2.5% over the fiscal framework over the course of the next 4 years. And in addition, we're spending 1.5% of GDP around resilience. So by the NATO definition, before the end of this decade, we are spending 4%. I'll remind the 5% is out there. What's important, what people care about is, I mean, yes, the bond market cares about and being responsible with taxpayer dollars, that's fundamental. But what matters is those capacities. What are we actually spending the money on? The first thing we spent money on was paying the women and men in the Canadian Armed Forces properly. Payments that match the weight of their responsibilities. In terms of fiscal transparency, I'm conscious of other questions, and we can go into this in more detail. I'm perfectly happy to. We have provision, for example, for the submarines, already provisioned for that within that fiscal track. So the decision that was announced yesterday, contract still to be negotiated, but the decision was out 2 days ago, apologize, that will not have an impact on the budget because the money has already been set aside for that. We will lay out in the budget an update with the decisions we're taking, where the fiscal track is, where the defense spending is, how we're spending the 1.5% on defense-related expenditures, resilience expenditures, and that's the right time to do it.
I'll give the Prime Minister credit. You know, he almost pulled the wool over people's eyes. The first thing we did when I said we were going to meet our NATO spending commitments is increase the pay of the soldiers. And I thought, wow, yeah, that's great. I mean, about time. And then it occurred to me, it's about time. We've been screwing over the women and men of the armed forces for years, nickel and diming them and giving them subpar equipment. When we have to commit to spending fast, that's an obvious one. That was righting a wrong. But I don't know that the women and men of the armed forces should be genuflecting when Mark Carney walks by and thanking him for the pay increase. They should have been getting pay increases way, way, way back. They should have been making this much money all along, if not more. I also want to point out he had no choice but to increase the pay because nobody was joining the armed forces. We had a serious recruitment problem. The Prime Minister talks about the threats. Again, I don't understand what the threats are. A lot of numbers. I think that's meant to confuse people. You know, it sounds transparent, but I think he was really just spinning us around in circles. Oh, don't worry about the subs. We already budgeted for them. When? Where is the line item for $100 billion on submarines over the next 10 years? I don't find that in the budget.
On burden shifting, sir.
Sure.
Yesterday, Secretary General Rutte announced big new capabilities for NATO. Airlift, refueling, area surveillance. But when President Trump arrived, all he talked about was the refusal of the allies to participate in the attack on Iran. Is there a mismatch between alliance leaders who want to talk about what NATO can do and a president who's fixated on what NATO won't do?
The alliance is a defensive alliance. It's not an offensive alliance. And in a world of evolving threats, it's important that we, as your question suggests, that we put ourselves in a position where we can defend our citizens. And that defense, that robust defense, has to be highly, highly credible to deter attacks and prevent the type of suffering we're seeing in Ukraine. Is there more to do in order to be in that position? Without question. And what Canada looks to in these meetings and all related meetings and interactions is to identify where those gaps are and help to close them and to do so in a transparent way. And that's a process. That's an iterative process. Yes, the President of the United States had a desire for more offensive support with respect to the Iran conflict, and it wasn't a direct ask of Canada. We didn't have the capabilities. We're not relevant from a base perspective in that theater, and that's between him and specific NATO allies.
On the submarine.
They're hypocrites, all of them. Carney, Maloney, Starmer, Macron, and the list goes on. They're all hypocrites. Everybody agrees Iran can never have a nuclear weapon. Everyone agrees. Everyone agrees. Iran can never have a nuclear weapon. The Americans are the only ones who did something about it. Somebody went in and made sure they will never have a nuclear weapon. Great. Thank you. The U.S., they suffered casualties. They were fired upon. To me, that's enough to trigger NATO participation. It is a defensive alliance, but the founding feature of NATO is if one of us is attacked, we consider it an attack on all of us, and we all respond. There was more than enough runway here for NATO to get involved. They just didn't want to. For political reasons, not because they don't agree Iran can't have a nuclear weapon. They let the U.S. go in and do the hard work and heavy lifting because politically they didn't want to deal with the consequences of it. It was the right thing to do. We agreed it was the right thing to do. We just didn't help. And we took pot shots at them from the cheap seats.
You've said that the economic benefits were a major part of the decision-making process. What was it that clinched it for the winning preferred bidder?
Yeah.
And is there a consolation prize for the prospective loser? They want to sell all kinds of things, land vehicles, etc.
Well, the first thing is that the process was run by the Defense Investment Agency. So there's a series of criteria that are there. Obviously, cost is a component of it. Both bidders, as you know, I think, had met the operational thresholds of the Royal Canadian Navy. So both were, seaworthy from their perspective or would perform the job. One of the, there's a set of related issues, though, such as sustainment. So how do we make sure that these subs are available for decades? Where does that sustainment take place? How is that expertise transferred from the bidders to Canadians and Canadian businesses so that Canada is doing the sustainment? There's associated industrial and technical benefits that came with both of the bids, which were evaluated. So it was a series of criteria and matched or assessed on a pairs basis. If you were allocating a score of 10, who do you give it? The 7-2 and the 3-2. That's effectively the process that the DIA takes. To the second part of your question, we have a deep strategic relationship with the Republic of Korea. I had a very productive conversation with President Lee on the weekend to inform him of the decision. Obviously, he was disappointed, but the conversation immediately pivoted at his initiative to a series of issues around AI and technology risks and how we can continue and deepen our cooperation there. We picked up on that conversation. We had a long bilateral here yesterday. That's not a consolation prize. That is allies working together strategically on important issues. There's just a host of other issues where we're going to work with Korea and build out and continue to do so.
Sure, they would have loved to sell us some submarines. I don't understand why the Prime Minister is being evasive on this. First off, I don't believe for a second the Defense Investment Agency made this decision. This decision was made by the Prime Minister's office and cabinet. Full stop. I'm sure there was great input from the Defense Investment Agency, another bureaucracy, but this decision was made at the top. South Korea has every right to be upset, and the reason they should be upset is because one of the stipulations for a sub that Canada would buy is it has to have interoperability with our NATO allies. The South Korean sub didn't. They're not part of NATO. It doesn't work with the other subs that the other NATO countries have. So we can't take it. We can't use it. We're part of NATO. We need to be aligned with our NATO partners when it comes to military assets. If we ever have to go to war, they have to be able to talk to each other and use similar or comparable radars, for example. Well, I mean, that should have taken South Korea out of the equation right away. Why do we string them along and let them pay Peter Mansbridge all that money for the commercials and stuff? I don't know why we did that. We should have just been upfront with them. Hey, your subs can't do it. Thanks for coming out. We'll work with you in some other way. The Prime Minister could have said, well, we didn't buy the subs from them, but we're going to go and get this, that, or the other thing from them. All he would say is they talked about the threat of AI. Okay, all right. If that's what you guys want to do with your time, fine. Maybe there's more coming, but I didn't get a strong indication that there is. Friends, I'm running low on time here, so I'm going to fast forward a little bit. I want to play for you a little bit of an announcement that the Prime Minister made when he was over in Turkey. Another summit, and somehow Volodymyr Zelensky from Ukraine managed to get into the meeting.
Canada will be announcing about $900 million of support for medium-term military support. When I say medium-term, in the coming months, both in terms of vehicles, both in terms of munitions and other support, in addition to this vital support for air defense, and then very much in terms of the needs on energy for the winter, but then beyond for the reconstruction.
There you go, friends. Ukraine, who is sitting on a massive gold reserve, whose economy is not in a recession, is getting another $900 million of our tax dollars. $900 million is what Carney gave Ukraine this time. Listen again.
Canada will be announcing about $900 million of support for medium-term military support. When I say medium-term, in the coming months.
$900 million. What could that do here in Canada? How many hospitals could we build? How much military procurement could we do for our own country? How does that work? $900 million that we're just going to hand over to another country. Now, I did see that on the news last night, but it was like buried at the end and it only lasted like 20 seconds. Even the news knows that is not popular. The vast majority of Canadians that I hear from say that we can't afford to keep giving away our money when we've got such pressing needs here in Canada. We've got record lineups at food banks, record homelessness, poverty rampant. It's amazing nobody's sending us money. Where's our foreign aid? People, I think, have had enough of our tax dollars being sent over to Ukraine, no matter how noble the cause may be. We just don't have the money. We're broke. And he's giving away our tax dollars. Let's go now to President Trump. I'm going to play a couple of clips from him before I wrap this episode up. I realize I'm going a little long here. Here is President Trump talking about Spain.
And I want to thank Mark. He's been a great Secretary General of NATO. I'm not happy with NATO because of what they did with Greenland. And I'm not happy with NATO because of the fact that they didn't want to help us with the number one state sponsor of terror. That's Iran. They were unwilling to help us. Now, in all fairness, I didn't speak to Mark about it. I think if I did, it might have been different, but we didn't need help. But I was really testing. I wanted to see whether or not they'd be there. And the answer is they were. I spoke to Germany. I spoke to France. Spoke to UK. Spoke to Italy. I didn't speak to Spain. Spain is a wasted cause. We don't want to do any trade business with Spain anymore, by the way. I'd like you to cut it off. Spain is a terrible partner in NATO. They don't participate. They don't pay. I don't want anything to do with Spain. Cut off all trade with Spain, please, including visits. Okay, we don't want anything to do. Watch them come running back. Oh, they'll come running back. They treat this man terribly, and this man's a good man too, great man. They're lucky they have him. But Spain doesn't agree to anything. And you shouldn't carry them. I mean, you sort of automatically carry because you're protecting an area, so they're there. So they probably figure they have to protect us, right? But we don't have to, and we don't have to trade with them. I don't want to do any more trade with them. All right?
Yes, sir.
Wow. The president very unhappy about Spain, and a lot of that has to do with when the U.S. was preparing the attack on Iran. He had asked for permission for U.S. planes to be able to use a base in Spain as a stopover refueling point on their way from America over to the Middle East. Spain said no, wouldn't even let the Americans land at their airport. That's the Spaniards clearly do not like the Americans right now, or Donald Trump. Maybe it's both. I'm not sure. Either way, when Trump said, fine, we just won't deal with Spain anymore. We're not doing any more trips, and I don't want to do any more trade. That's what he said. Well, this was him on Air Force One last night. Apparently, the Spaniards have changed their mind.
Before the NATO summit, you spoke. Who are you with? Reuters. You had not the best. You had issues with. You said you had issues with leaders of Spain, UK.
Yeah. Spain, I will say, I did have issues with
also
Spain,
Germany,
and I still do.
But Spain came back all the way today. Spain was very generous today. You know, I told them I'm going to stop trading.
What did Spain do there?
They made, they honored the request for lots of payment. And if they didn't, we wouldn't even talk to them. They were very bad. They behaved very badly, in my opinion. But there was great unity in that room today, the NATO room. It was pretty amazing, actually. There was something very good about it. I actually wish the press was able to stay. Now, they may have been different if the press was there, but there was tremendous unity and togetherness. It was quite nice.
Now, that's a little contradictory from the president. I don't know what it is actually that Spain did, but he's strongly suggesting that Spain stroked a check for some bill that the Americans believe they owe. When it comes to the cooperation, the unity that he talked about in the room after the media left, is it possible that they're extremely unified in private, but in front of the media they like to fight? I really don't know. That's a rhetorical question, but it certainly doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of unity. The president himself has threatened to pull out of NATO several times now. I don't know why the NATO allies would be so unified with the Americans right now. I'd like to know what happened there. We probably won't. They're not going to tell us, but either way, it's a little hard to reconcile that. The president's biggest issue with NATO is underspending and that they wouldn't be there to support America, but America would always be there to support them. And he used Iran as an example. When he went into Iran, they didn't help. Okay, well, now if there's unity, does that mean that it's water under the bridge? Are bygones bygones? I think that is a story still being written. One more from President Trump. This is only a minute long.
Well, that's what hurt my relationship with NATO, because Greenland doesn't help Denmark. Denmark doesn't spend money to really help Greenland, but it's an important part for the United States. And it's surrounded by China ships and Russian ships. And that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. It was Greenland that, and it continues to be, that should be controlled by the United States, not by Denmark. And when they wouldn't go along with it, and with all the money we spend to help them with Russia, and we don't have to spend any money, we could remove all of our soldiers out of Europe. Because as you probably noticed, Europe's a very different place than it was 20 years ago. A lot different, much different. It's a much different, and they better be careful with immigration and energy. If they're not careful with those two things, you're not going to have a Europe anymore. Okay, thank you very much, everybody.
Wow, he is all over the place sometimes. I feel like that was 4 different thoughts put into 2 and not even strung together all that well. But either way, I think everyone understands the president does not like the road that Europe is going down, and I think that's part of the reason that he's making America much more isolated in the world. A lot of the issues that Europe's dealing with, we're dealing with here in Canada, though, too. That's an interesting thing to keep in mind when it comes time for Canadians to make a choice about which way we want to go. Do we want to align with the Americans, or do we want to align with the Europeans and continue on with more of what's going on now? Friends, that's going to do it for me. Tomorrow, listener DMs. Can't wait to hear from you. Have yourselves an amazing Thursday, and I'll catch you right back here in less than 24 hours.